appreciate everyone joining us today. Really, this is a continuation of our conversation started a couple weeks ago around the health and wealth of America. We partnered with the Harris Poll to really look at the prosperity of America and the health and wealth of America. And I think we were taken initially by some of the work the Harris Poll has done around fear. So hence sort of the Halloween theme about being scared and today. So we're excited to have John from Harris Poll and Zachary Carabel, someone who's been a long time part of our community. So really appreciate everyone joining us. Like I said, take a second, fill out the poll if you can. We have most of the people had filled it out, but if you haven't yet, please do that. If you have questions, if you have comments during the session, please use the chat function, and then we will try to pull in as many voices as we can over the next 45 minutes or so. So without further ado, I will hand it over to David, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Josh. And I did love the music, even if I got the attribution of the last one wrong. Really enjoyed hearing those. Yeah, it is scary right now. And I'm really happy to have John and Zachary here. I think Josh more or less introduced them. Zachary's written multiple books. He has spoken at Techonomy multiple times. He's served as a moderator and as a panelist, wrote a book about China, which we've sometimes interrogated him about. And he writes a regular column for all kinds of places, lately, mostly Time. John is the president of the Harris Poll, and as Josh mentioned, we're partnering with them on some really good forward-looking research. But here he's going to talk about some work that Harris Poll has been doing since the beginning of the pandemic, in which they've been steadily polling Americans and people all around the world on their feelings and particularly their fears. But before, and John is going to start by giving us a little presentation of some of what they've learned. But I just wanted to mention as we get started, in paying attention to the news, particularly around the election, it is stunning how for all of, particularly President Trump's efforts to shift the discussion away from the pandemic, one of the real consistent journalistic learnings of the last couple weeks is that it is impossible. Americans are focused on the pandemic, whether anyone wants them to be or not. That is the universal concern. I know I was just watching TV this morning and people interviewing voters coming out of polling places. That's what they're saying they're thinking about is the pandemic. So we are somewhat scared. And there's a lot more we'll get into, other things. Obviously, the election's coming up on Tuesday. Some people have fears about that. I'd say probably majority of people have some form of fear about that. And I think when we maybe after John does his presentation, we'll go through, give you the result of the polls, of our poll of you, because hopefully we'll get a few more people to fill it out before we do that. But John, I'm going to turn it over to you. You can take over the screen and show us your slides and tell us what you've learned.
Okay, thanks, David and Zachary and Josh. Really excited to be here. You know what I'll do is I'll jump in and talk a little bit about some of the data that we've been collecting over the past year. Well, almost a year. It feels like maybe 10 years to most people, looking at American sentiment on COVID. And I'm also going to share a little bit of global data from some recent work that we've just done and presented at the Milken Institute. And David, I just want to keep it casual. So like jump in when you see a scary chart, because I have no shortage of scary charts to fit the theme. Okay, so let me know when you guys can see this. So
we can see it. Yep, no slide. Oh, there's a slide. Good.
All right, there we go. Success. Yeah. So this was we're going to draw on a couple of things, but this was some work that we did just shared last week or the week before with Milken, and this was looking at a robust study of about 10,000 citizens weighted for natural demographics in each country. And what we did is we called it the listening project because we just wanted to go out and talk to people about if there was a change in their life, what single most important issue would be most important to them that they'd want sort of solved. And we had actually compiled all this data back in February, and then the pandemic hit. But it gave us a great opportunity to go back into the field and then survey again in September and early October, which we did. And that kind of gives us the basis of trying to understand, pretty much dislocation around the world, and also sort of how people are thinking differently about the world that they live in right now and what are the most urgent priorities. So I'm just going to start with America, and this is a trended chart that goes back to March 15th. So when the pandemic took off, we started weekly weekend polling on all things COVID. And you can see at the beginning, back in March, 54% of Americans thought the national fear was irrational. Now today that's 72%. They think that it's sensible. But I think what's really interesting in this chart is that a couple of things. One, the fears have not subsided, right? This doesn't look like, an up and down sort of, heartbeat monitor. This is sort of constant fear, but the fears did sort of come in different waves, right? So that began with ventilator shortages at 74%. That's 68% today. The fear of a global recession kind of came right after that at 84%. That's holding at 71%. And then you get this thing that's really powerful, this fear of a new wave at 79, that's now 77, and then fear of returning back to public activity. This is really the issue in our country, right? Is it despite, all the campaign stops on either side, there's really profound fear in America, and people are afraid to return to public activity. We have 20% interest in flying on an airplane right now in America. 40% in staying in a hotel, and people are really trying to stay close to home. But then take a look at this chart at the bottom. These two slides, I don't know if you can see the colors. So one is fear of losing your job in purple, and the other one is fear of dying from COVID. And these two fears have basically kind of posed an existential threat to life, right? Our livelihoods or our lives. And that's really sort of a tale of 2020, I think, because they've kind of stranded together like spaghetti, each one going up and down. And I think that kind of gives you a little bit of insight into people's calculus about how they're thinking about their lot in life right now, right? And so the fear of dying is up, at 55%. That's up 5 points from last weekend as we now approach 90,000 cases. So I don't know.
I have a question for you.
Yeah, go for it.
From those two stats on fear of dying and particularly fear of losing your job, do you have any breakdown on Republicans and Democrats on that?
Yeah, Democrats are far more fearful than Republicans by probably about a 14-point margin. That's consistent in a lot of the COVID questions. Women are far more concerned about these issues, as are certainly older people. And people with under household income of 100K, that's another really profound issue. We have 80% of people that are under 100,000 household income are afraid to take public transportation, yet it's a necessity for many people in America.
Thanks.
Zach, does this chart scary to you?
People's fear is alarming to me. There should be a line of what scares you more, the specifics or the fact that people are scared. I was going to get into this later, but I will before you get into your other charts. So long before pandemic land, and I don't know how far back your data goes. Fearful attitudes versus hopeful attitudes. I'm 100% sure, but I don't have the data, that if you went from 1950 and you went decade by decade by decade, if, fear would have been at a kind of a lower ebb in the 50s, except for communism and potentially nuclear destruction.
Mm-hmm.
Would have kind of gone, fear would have gone down in the 60s, way up in the 70s, down in the 80s, way down in the 90s. And then since about 2001, except for certain blips, there's just been a kind of a rising fear percentage, certainly in the Western world. So some of these, trends, obviously you wouldn't have had the pandemic, but you would have had fear of losing a job. All these things have been growing. And in that, I've often tried to harken back to Franklin Roosevelt's inaugural address in March of 1933, which most people do remember as the "we have nothing to fear but fear itself" line. What's fascinating is what he then says in the next clause, which no one remembers because it's too convoluted. But he says, "Let me assert that my firm belief is that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance." And his point when he makes that isn't that there was nothing to be scared of, right? Because that would have been ludicrous in March of 1933. There was a lot to be scared of. People were lining up for food. There were massive unrest. There was, a dust bowl in the heartland that was totally separate, eroding crops, and people were, fleeing for the West. So there were things to be scared of. But his point was that fear as the foundation for social solutions is not only useless, it's actually destructive. And that's, I think, the problem. So when I said to you, honestly, what scares me is the fear. I'm not just, that wasn't a toss off line. It was a feeling of fear is a good wake up call for us individually and collectively, but it's not a good foundation for, okay, what do we do now to ensure that our fears don't come true?
Let's definitely dig into that more after John tells us even more about what we're afraid of. And I did, in my introduction of Zachary, neglect to mention the Progress Network, which he dutifully put into the chat to everyone to make sure that is a key reason we asked him to be part of this, because he really is working hard on a more positive future spin that we should all be thinking about. So he'll explain that in some detail in a minute, but thank you for that intervention, Zachary.
Yeah, and I think, Zachary, that's really interesting, because it really dovetails into some of the other things that we're even seeing globally. You look on the left, you can just see sort of, I shaded some places around the world where different fears manifest themselves differently and where they pop in sort of different cultures and societies. So you get fear of a global recession. That's at 86% global average right now. 33%, though, they're more optimistic, that maybe we'll come out of this faster around the world, people trying to feel like maybe there's some silver lining in all this. But look at, 7 out of 10 people around the world fear of losing their job. 68%, they feel that their life has changed in a major way, right? So that this dislocation has created so much uncertainty that, what is around the corner is too hard for any of us to tell. And Zach, kind of what you were just talking about, that 71% of people, including, in the US, 74% think this is the lowest point in the country's history. And that's something, David, maybe we could get into and talk about, because perspective is everything, right?
And Zachary is a real historian, so I think we'll want to hear him talk about that in more detail in a minute. Yeah, and that's kind of amazing. That's 74%.
But it's contextual, right? I mean, this is the Great Depression for most people that are alive today. And then, just general fear and anxiety.
So they know so little history. The only history they know is what they've lived. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's what you're more succinct than I am as a researcher, David. But I like this chart a lot too. This is a lot of squiggly lines to tell you one simple thing, which is that sort of the negative emotions have been running along the bottom: anger, claustrophobia, cabin fever, loneliness, annoyed, overwhelmed. But look at the top 3 things that have held steady: appreciation, thankfulness, gratefulness, compassion, right? So this sense of reappraisal around all of this fear, I think, is something that I'd really love for us to kind of talk about. I know it's core, Zachary, to what you do, but there is this sense that people are living through a time when they're reappraising relationships, their kids, their spouses, their partners, and thinking about things that maybe they've taken for granted. We're seeing spirituality up in our data. We're seeing, mindfulness, meditation, because mental health and anxiety is so overwhelming right now. We're seeing lots of emphasis on self-care. So a lot of interesting things, I think, that are hopeful in some of the negative stuff. And my gosh, we are social creatures, right? So this is just showing how much stuff we miss. We miss going to church. We miss seeing our friends and family. I mean, these numbers have held steady since the beginning of the crisis, in sort of the 60s, 70s, 50s, about what people are really missing. And we're also taking care of each other. This is some work we did with the CDC last month. And one of the really interesting media narratives that I don't buy into is that young people are just these sort of super spreaders that are just selfish. And that's not what we're seeing. If you see the Gen Z numbers, this was a study that we did looking at sort of vigilance and compliance. And we see Gen Z just as high as the national population. And in fact, young people between 16 and sort of 18, 19, this time is so hard on them. They're making decisions about colleges. Their entire life is interrupted. And so they are being actually more compliant than even sort of older, younger, older Gen Z. So, in this, another sort of related thing that I'll toss out for conversation is sort of this thing we call the Great American Rethink, right? This is a time on reflection, we may make some really, really big decisions, right? So there's some, data here about, 6 in 10 plan to save more and spend less. We do believe there is big time built up revenge spending that's sitting out there in 2021, particularly in the travel category, as people are focused on staying home and closer. They're thinking a lot about in-person online learning, a reality in most households, 55%, and believing that that may be here to stay. They're more likely to have children because of the pandemic. How fascinating is that? 49%, back to maybe that gratitude and reflection. And then people are, getting on health kicks. There's a lot more of these Pelotoning going on at 42%. And, 3 in 10 are thinking about changing careers. So, empathy is at play, and some of those donuts you can see at the bottom, more active in charities. And then, we're seeing people that are interested in buying homes at 35%, and a lot of people, particularly in urban areas, that are more willing to sort of move out of where they're at and recontemplate life in green acres.
John,
Yeah.
Why are they more interested in having children? Is that because they're home, they can more readily now, or is it just, is there something bigger?
Well, we originally thought there was a baby boom that was going to exist in this thing, but I think it could be more around this reappraisal relationship sort of thing that's happening. Online dating, the COVID online dating's become really big, and then the fact that I think people are maybe hurrying up decisions that perhaps they would not have thought of on the original timetables. And maybe that's connected to some of these other trends. I don't know for sure, but like working from home and, working in the office, is this giving people more flexibility, less time that people are on the road, thinking that they've got more time to be able to do this? I don't know.
Thanks.
Yeah, just a couple other things. I think this is really interesting around just the profound leadership crisis that we have in the world. So, very hard as a researcher to feel confident when we ask government type questions in countries that aren't completely, don't have complete freedoms. So the China, Malaysia data I look at with a little bit of suspect, but look across to sort of the developed countries, the other developed countries, US, UK, Mexico, Italy, Japan. I mean, you've got literally, no more than 2 in 10, maybe 3 in 10 saying that they support how their country has handled the COVID-19 pandemic. This is a real low level of sort of confidence and leadership in governments across countries. And the other part of it is just how tone deaf they feel they are, that they lack an understanding of a sense of being in touch with the profound suffering that people have, both economically and also from a public health perspective. And then, this sense of empathy, I think, is really important. 2/3 of people globally almost say that people running the country don't really care what happens to me. And, with that, the last 2 slides I'll kind of tee up are something I think could be an interesting opportunity for business as a whole, which is, in previous crisis, businesses were part of the problem, global financial crisis, obviously. But in this crisis, we have seen major reputations rise in sort of interesting categories. I have been in business for a long time, and I've never seen these types of pharma numbers rise. A more positive view by 33% of the pharmaceutical industry, or technology, which, David, you've written books on it. You know how tech has been battered. And yet, I think people are being more pragmatic. As you look at a lot of these different sectors, a lot of these sectors aren't that sexy, oil, automotive, financial services, but they were all germane and critical to keeping our country running. And so they gave people a sense of that sense of contentment and satisfaction. So we think, lastly, that there's this opportunity for sort of business to, meet this moment. And we did a comparison around the world. This is the global data again of the 27 countries. And look at 9 out of 10 think companies did a better job than their government in their country in keeping the country running. And 55% trust them more than their government on COVID. And, you know, you see these other donuts that sort of talk about the importance of leading with values. This has become a critical juncture. You know, in a crisis, you're really understanding where the character is. And there's a lot of interest in business right now, 78% respectively on the upper right, wanting companies to address COVID, and really particularly big multinational companies that have the wherewithal to do that. And then lastly, at the bottom, you know, sort of roughly 8 in 10 people globally expect leadership to speak out on social issues. They better have their house in order because their history is important. And interestingly, this sense of forgiveness, guys, you know, that even if a company stumbles, it's important to see how they think and what their intentions are. And it's really important to align with their internal values. So that's sort of a really high level look at just some of the scary charts that we have that we thought might frame
Really
a little
interesting.
this conversation.
I have 1 or 2 quick questions, then I
Sure.
want to let Zachary give an extended response and talk about the Progress Network. That chart you showed of how people think their country's response has been so egregious. I think in the US, the number was 29%. That's even lower than the number of people who think the president's response has been bad, it seems like. So is it worse in the US if you put it in terms of the country as opposed to the administration? First of all, that's one question. But the other question, looking at it for all those countries, do you anticipate a sort of global tendency toward wholesale leadership change in country after country in coming months and years because of that dissatisfaction?
I think on the first question, the issue is when you insert politics into it, then you're going to get a more polarized camp and the numbers are going to go up. So it would have been more supportive if I had asked that question about the Trump administration. And I do have some breaking data that we just released yesterday with Harvard. We have a Harvard Harris poll, but you know, Trump's approval on COVID is about 46% right now. And that's really rough to get reelected. You pretty much need to be on the 50 to 55 range to really feel confident. And he's got 54% disapproval. But the numbers really become that more pessimistic when you take sort of the politics out of it and you're able to lump Democrats and Republicans in and say, did your government do a good job?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah,
okay,
the second one, Zachary,
on
take that one. I'll let Zachary take the second one. That's a good question.
Okay, Zachary, say anything you want, and I got questions if you run out of ideas.
Wait, what was the second one?
The second one was whether we're going to see a wholesale change in governments around the world. Everybody feels their country did such a shitty job at responding.
I mean, John knows this well. There has been a generalized decrease in trust in government over the past 20 years. And so, you know, again, if you juxtaposed the current 2020 Harris data against, you know, your own data over the past 20 years, stuff that really began in the 1990s, global trust and American trust as part of that in every major institution has been going down. I think in the United States, the only exception to that was the military for a long period of time. So I do think you have to look at that in context, right? Those numbers were not startlingly high pre-COVID. They're just being reinforced. But that augurs against the levels of political instability that you think would follow from those numbers. I mean, there's going to be, you know, we're having an election right now, so there is some degree of a referendum on government, as there are in every democracy with some periodicity. I'm just saying, I don't think you can read into those numbers future political instability. One of the remarkable things about the past 10 to 12 years has been, in spite of the global financial crisis and now the pandemic, the absence of political turmoil is astonishing relative to one's expectation that should naturally follow. And, you know, I don't have a crystal ball, so 2021 might see, you know, massive global upheaval. I'm not making a prediction about that, but I am noting that the actions that follow from these attitudes are much fuzzier than the attitudes themselves. What's fascinating in the Harris poll work, and is truly a reversal, which you pointed out, is the shift toward trust in corporate world, and it's across you know, corporate industries. You know, yeah, I don't think I'm not sure if oil and gas was up there. That may be, but you know, that is a startling shift in 2020 relative to trends over the past 20 years. Media would not have had particularly high marks. Technology has, meaning most Americans have thought their tech companies. If anything, trust in technology has gone down in 2020 in relative terms. It's still very high, but with the whole, actions against Facebook, Google, antitrust. And I guess my one other comment for those looking to, because the desire is always to take these data sets and then make predictions, not just political predictions. Attitudes like trust have a longer burn, so it's like, trust is harder to gain and easier to lose. I would say that shift in corporate is really interesting. We'll have to see where that goes. Things like what people intend to, what people say they intend to do.
Mhm.
And John, please tell me if you think this is wrong. Tend to be the least valuable as indicative of future actions, because what people say they think they're going to do based on their sentiments in the present is frequently at strong variance with how they actually then behave. So people always say when they're feeling economically anxious, they're going to cut back their spending. But unless they lose their job, if they have a paycheck, they almost always increase their spending, even though they will always say they're going to decrease it. The predictor of like spending tends to be income, not sentiment, nearly as much as we think. So I just think, where this leads, I don't quite know. And a lot of it is solidifying multi-year trends. It's not reversing them, except for the corporate one, which again is the most startling as a break from a 20-year trend. And the other thing, and then we can open this up for discussion. As I mentioned, and as David mentioned, as I shamelessly put out, I started something a few weeks ago that I had been working on pre-pandemic and then considered not launching during the pandemic, and then was convinced that I absolutely had to inaugurate during the pandemic, was this thing called the Progress Network, which right now is simply a nonprofit megaphone for a lot of voices out there in the ether, many of whom are vaguely prominent in their own right, that are suggesting that the future could be a more constructive one than we fear, that our ability to solve our problems could be more dramatically positive than we believe, and that in any event, my own conviction being, given the uncertainty of the future and the imperative of writing that well for ourselves and our children, that what we do and how we think and what we say shapes what that future is going to be. So that the more you kind of give in that Rooseveltian way to the fear of the moment, the less able you are to actually create that constructive future. It's a little fake it till you make it, or be the change you want. And I know those have kind of their own new agey Dale Carnegie aspects, but there's some truth to those insofar as we don't know what the future is. We are, all of us, in the ever-present process of making that future. And if we are relentlessly giving way to dystopian despair and the belief that everything is going to hell in a handbasket, we are that much more likely, I believe, to create that future than we are to come together collectively to solve actual problems. And sometimes I hear myself talking this way, and we are in such a dark, kind of cynical moment that even the evocation of those words coming from my own mouth, I sometimes go, oh, come on, give me a break, because it can sound hopelessly naive in a moment of such incredible conviction that everything is getting worse, from climate change to political dysfunction to global chaos and all those things. And whether or not those things are fully true, we all seem to fully inhabit them. And I do think that becomes enervating and paralyzing. And it leads to short-termism. It leads to, if you really think tomorrow is going to be worse than today, why would you ever start a company? If you really believe that society is going downhill, why would you forestall short-term gratification for long-term benefit, right? If the only thing you have as an advantage is, sorry, my phone is, if the only thing you have as an advantage is your moment, you're going to spend what you've got while you've got it. You're not going to save, you're not going to give money away, you're not going to invest for the future, because the future isn't investable. And countries that believe that, I mean, Russia, to some degree, if you look at public attitudes in Russia, is a country with a deep-seated conviction in the worsening of the world, of the country. And you do tend to, there's more suicides, people drink more. All these things are evident. Despair and fear are self-fulfilling prophecies, and they may be true. And so my final point in this is, I am not saying tomorrow is going to be better. I am saying it's up to us to try to make sure that tomorrow is better. And the conviction that it will be worse is almost certainly an ingredient in that becoming true. And that we cannot talk ourselves into a morass. And there are a lot of very interesting voices out there that I thought we should pay more attention to, just because they are sensibilities of problem solving. A lot of the people I've assembled so far are quite pessimistic about the present, really think they're real problems. So again, this isn't a Pollyannish, oh, things are great, we should look at more cat pictures and talk about how we love each other. It's an awareness that there are real problems, but that we're capable of solving them. And that if those don't cohere, because they don't in a culture where there's cacophonous doom and the news is always about the bad news, right? There is no good news in the news because it doesn't generate eyeballs. It's not effective as a commercial product to say, today we muddled through, right? That's not a headline. But then unless those voices cohere, they will remain atomized, no matter how prominent they are. And it's basically the idea, and I'll be, this is like obscure intellectual movement references 101, but if Henry James and Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson, all of whom were prominent writers at the end of the 19th century, if they had never met each other, they just would have been three interesting guys writing stuff, and there would have been no transcendentalist movement. So unless a network comes together, unless people are aware and build upon each other, it's almost certainly going to be less than the sum of their collective parts. So I wanted to create a platform that would amplify these sensibilities.
How many people do you have on there now, Zachary?
I think it's close to 80. It's
80,
mostly
wow.
American, but not only American. I'm sure that will get up
to
to
a few names. There's a lot of pretty famous writers on there.
Angela Duckworth, Anne-Marie Slaughter, Kishore Mahbubani, David Brooks, Fareed Zakaria, Ezekiel Emanuel, Safi Bakal. It's a long list. Peniel Joseph.
It's sort of it's a way to make sure that their writings get attention and also get referenced to one another, since they are in many ways arguing in parallel. I have a question for you, and I want to share the poll, but before I do, I have one question.
Let me just finish. So none of that is like in any way kind of invalidates any of the, the data of fear and despair. It's more of okay, now what do we do with that?
Yeah, but I wanted, you mentioned the Russian national character. What about the American national character? I think if there's anything that has distinguished us from other countries, at least in our own minds, over long periods, it is that we believed ourselves to be more forward-looking and optimistic than many other countries, which I would assume remains an asset for us to recover. And do you believe that?
I think it certainly was a massive asset over history for the United States, often well in excess of reality. Meaning, the United States it's often been called a creedal nation, right? We don't have ethnicity, we don't have necessarily shared history, we have shared creed. We have shared belief in the Constitution and this vision of what the country would be. And that, one of the things that's led to is beliefs that are often more like ideals, or beliefs that are well ahead of reality. And that was manifestly in evidence in the 1950s, where the United States was self-touting its freedom and its beacon of light in a sea of communist threat, which was true insofar as it went, right? But it left out African Americans, it left out a certain amount of inclusion of women in the workforce, it left out anybody who's different or other. So it was great if you were part of it, not so great if you weren't. Again, I'm not trying to do revisionist history here, and I don't want to get into whatever those heated debates are. It's simply saying that we've often put our sense of what we are ahead of what we are. And I think, honestly, I think that's true on the flip side. I mean, if the right in the United States is guilty of overweening self-touting of what the United States is relatively, the left is often guilty of overweening touting of what we are negatively. And both are manifestations of a kind of a distorted self-image, right? Because saying you're the worst is kind of is equally exceptional and arrogant as saying you're the best. It just is the other side of the coin. Saying we're a little bit.
Sorry, no, go on. Sorry.
No, go on.
If you're trying to take a more global view, though, it's interesting. For better or for worse, we do still seem to have a leadership role. I mean, if you look at even, for example, what's happening in Nigeria, where they're saying they're inspired by the Black Lives Matter demonstrations. Right. So we have capacity to self-heal potentially as a country, and also we still have an extraordinary, in kind of, I don't know if it's not authority but it's potential as a role model for other countries. But let me quickly share the results of the poll. And even as I do, I want to encourage, I see Catherine has just done so. Please put your questions or comments in the chat, and we'd like to hear from all of you. But if you look at the results, you know, generally you're more scared than you were, although some of you are not. But when we ask, do you think the country is scared? 96% of you, actually, I can tell you that no only represented one person who did not think the country was scared. So if you're scared, what are you most scared of? The leading issue being outcome of the election, but only slightly more than the pandemic. And you're scared of a lot of stuff, a lot of things. And you think the country is scared about probably less than you're scared about, which is interesting. I mean, but the outcome of the election, number one. But this is where I want to make sure I highlighted, in light of what Zachary's saying, you know, can we create a vibrant, healthy society in the future? 73% of you still believe the answer to that is yes. And would you like to see more focused work and organizing around a positive future vision? This should be heartening for Zachary. Every single one of you answered yes to that question. So you can click it and close it if you want to for yourselves. I'll keep sharing it. Catherine, you want to just say what you said there on live? If I can quickly respond, maybe if Josh is not faster than me.
Yep,
Can you turn her audio on? Yeah, Catherine, say something. Say what you said. And identify yourself.
Okay, I'm Catherine Steiner-Adair. I am a member of the Taconomy community. I do research on sort of the psychological impact of things in the culture that undermine kids thriving. My most recent bestseller was about the impact of technology on families, education, and kids.
And you're a psychotherapist.
So, I'm a psychotherapist as well. So I've been hearing, I work a lot in independent schools and some schools that tilt very progressive, some schools that are challenged with being very mixed in their parent body as well as student body. And what I'm hearing, interestingly, more in the progressive tilting schools, although also a few conservative ones earlier today, certainly, is a inability or concern I have. I've been doing some helping schools develop little trainings for Monday to help teachers contain themselves and be a little bit more mindful and self-regulated about their own thinking and emotions, because they're very dark. The recent situation with the Supreme Court, I think, makes people feel like the institutions themselves are starting to become dysfunctional. And that's different. That feels like a different degree of disintegration of a functional or semi-functional democracy. But I feel like faculty right now are asking for and needing enormous support to deal with their own emotional reactivity and feelings about this.
But also, as you said in the chat, you want some support for an optimistic vision coming from those people.
Yes, I do, because what we know is, first of all, if you look at who thrives in the Blitz, or if you look at the research on kids, what makes kids actually keep it together and become more resilient through tough things, it's having a teacher or a parent who remains calm and optimistic throughout the situation. So if we've got teachers saying, oh my God, this country's falling apart, I can't believe it, who are those idiots who are voting differently from the way I think, or racism has never been at its most blatant and rampant in our country, where it's not getting better. Black Lives Matter is causing such a profound backlash. So I think that the practices and sort of the approach, Zachary, that you're talking about, both of you, about trying to hold a picture where the tools of our humanity and the capacity to, at a person-to-person and community level, really build towards a more ethical and positively connected and conscientious culture. I am optimistic, actually, very much so. I think we need to revision the core, and I think we really need curriculum in this country, and I think we need to really think about what it means to be an American. But But most of all, I'm hoping that you will really pay attention to the educators, because they are the people who have the hearts and the eyes and the ears and the minds of the future generation. And they are really struggling. And not
Yeah.
all schools can do what private schools are doing, which is bringing people like me and you guys to support their faculty.
Thank you for that.
Grown-ups'
That's really good.
reactions to this
Either
election
of
are going to
you,
be critical.
I mean, I think part of
either,
it, you know, on John's data set, you know, the 60 percentiles that were felt they were focusing more on compassion, on, you know, mindfulness, wellness, which is nearly as high as any of the fears that people are focusing on, right? But it is certain that no media outlet will focus on those three things as part of the data set to the degree that the other things are focused on. And even if they're focused on, they won't have follow-up, right?
Exactly, Zachary. And I think the other part at the core of that was this sense of reflection and gratitude, you know, and I think that's like really interesting. And that's why I kind of share your guys' optimism about this, because I kind of feel like this has been a bit of a game of bocce ball. You know, it's like COVID was the bocce ball that got thrown into the mix and everything's sort of rearranged. And, you know, we're just seeing like far more interesting data that we had not seen in decades of Harris Poll research around attitudes towards racial equality and systemic racism. You know, we did a poll on back in 2004 during the tragic killing of Michael Brown, and we redid it this summer, and the differences on, you know, systemic acknowledgement of systemic racism, acknowledgement of Black Americans, and the plights that they face against the police reform, all these questions were literally a 15-point, 20-point difference. So, you know, and even one of the really great things that we see in our data now is that 77% say the racial equality movement feels different because more people are involved. And so, you know, I don't quite know where all that goes, David, but I think it's just really interesting that there does seem to be a reappraisal that COVID sort of brought on that maybe make you think about different issues differently.
well, since Zachary is such a historian, I'm curious to have his reaction to a part of that. Let's just say Biden wins, which it seems like a reasonable possibility. Compared to dark times in the past where we really, you know, like the New Deal after the Depression, you know, and coming out, Roosevelt being your classic example, do you think there's a possibility that we could come out in the end better, considerably better than we were before COVID and before Trump? And let me just finish the question, because it is so interesting, the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, and a lot of other things that have happened in reaction to Trump's attitudes and governmental behavior that have somewhat forced issues to the surface that needed to be forced to the surface, and now are relentlessly on the surface, that many of us might argue is an awfully good thing, as John was just pointing out. So what comes next if Biden wins, Zach?
Look, I think the only source of short-term optimism around that is if, you know, winners have to be magnanimous and not vindictive in a democratic society. And, you know, we have increasingly, if you look at like the massive arc of American history, things came to an incredibly deadly head in the Civil War. And that may have been, you know, both literally and metaphorically a black and white issue. And there's a lot to be said for, you know, some of the compromises during Reconstruction, allowing for structural racism to continue for another 90 years. But there were also aspects of the post-Civil War, which were, if we're actually going to be one country, we have to somewhat figure out a way to live with each other. And, you know, given my own biases and probably the ones for most of the people in this community, just statistically and geographically and demographically, you know, whatever, liberal intelligentsia / democratic America cannot dismiss the 40+% of America that voted for Trump eternally. You know, I mean, everybody has every country has its lunatic fringe or has its fringe. So let's just leave that as part of the mix that maybe you don't have to embrace. You know, you don't have to embrace violent anarchy and white nationalism. That's not necessary. Although you do have to find a way to actually integrate people into a society somehow. But you cannot simply, you know, do a devils and angels constantly back and forth. Otherwise, we're just going to continue whatever it is that the present is a manifestation of, and we're just going to continue that into the future. So from a purely, regardless of who wins on Tuesday, there does need to be, and I think we need to check this within ourselves, right? The more you demonize your adversaries, the more your adversaries are likely to become demons. And that is historically true, it's observationally true, and that the United States, like any society with deep divisions, when it has thrived the most, it's thrived because people are willing to kind of deal with difference. One of the great myths of the United States was that the Constitution and Jefferson and his notes on Virginia got together and decided with Enlightenment ideals to allow for religious toleration, right? A sort of a noble, we will not force upon citizens of this country some religious creed that they either have to accept or face massive civil and violent consequences, which have been true of Europe for several hundred years. But this wasn't done because they sat around and went, wow, I as a practicing Baptist really, really respect Massachusetts Congregationalists. It was done from the perspective of, if I expend all my energy trying to eliminate them, we're simply going to descend into a morass of chaos and dysfunction. Yeah. So it wasn't like, wow, I totally respect you. It was, I simply have to find a way to live with you. The coexistence, I wrote this book once about peaceful coexistence between Muslims, Christians, and Jews over the centuries of Islamic rule. Coexistence is often simply, I'm not going to try to kill you and demonize you, and I got to find a way to live with you. And that's a pretty low bar, but it's a bar that we are in our current society often failing to even surmount.
Yeah.
So I think we need a lot of that in the present, and it doesn't matter who wins next week, because unless we're willing to kind of accept that you are going to have to interact with and work at times constructively with people whose views you may indeed find abhorrent, but there may be areas of coincidence, right? I mean, the one thing that happened in the past 3 years that was remarkable was criminal justice reform, which was signed into law at the end of 2017. It's end of 2017 or 2018, I can't remember now. Which had a very bizarre set of coalitions from like the Koch brothers on the one hand to Rob Reich and lots of progressive groups that have been arguing against certain federal approaches to criminal justice. And that's an example of sometimes you just have to work with people.
One thing I noticed in the answers this group gave, 81% of you are concerned about political violence, which is something very new. I don't think we would have seen a stat like that anytime, and I assume John would agree, until maybe the last few months. And I want John to respond to this notion of, and we only got 4 more minutes in this session, sadly, but I want John to based on what you know about the attitudes of the American people, what do you think is the possibility that the kind of mindset that Zachary said we need is possible? And before you answer that, I would just say, among my liberal intelligentsia New York friends, there is a stark division, it seems to me, although it's not much discussed, between those who absolutely detest and will not engage at all with Trump supporters, and people who say, yeah, some live on my block and I'm still friends with them, and I don't agree with them. There's a real division on the quote unquote left in that regard, it seems to me. But John, any thoughts?
No, I mean, I think what Zachary said, I absolutely agree with. And, there's a lot of hopeful sort of points of confluence in some of the data where you will find people agreeing. We see agreeing on social distancing and mask mandates by and large. Those cut across Republicans and Democrats. We'll find interesting parts where people are agreeing in interesting ways. I mean, we just did this Harvard Harris poll I was saying, and, Americans are 75% think they're all agreeing that the next sort of 6 months are going to be the same or worse. And so I think there's lots of places where there is agreement, but if you continue to demonize, and it's just such simplification, right? It's a simplification to sort of put people into these red and blue camps, or, as Hillary Clinton did, to refer to Trump supporters as deplorables. I mean, that is exactly the type of handles that have created simplicity and created the division we live in.
But it's true. We do have to wrap, but I would just observe as a professional observer of Facebook, among the other reasons I'm saying what I'm about to say. When you hear people spouting this kind of QAnon stuff, it makes it especially hard to treat them sympathetically and empathetically, because some of that stuff seems so crazy. And so somehow we have to get a grip on the distribution of certain kinds of messaging or counter it in some new creative way, because that really drives a wedge further. I'm sorry, we're not going to get to Robin Raskin's interesting point about we're closing down from being citizens of the world, but we really have an absolute hard stop in about 1 minute. I would just thank John and Zachary tremendously for what's been a very rich and interesting conversation. And I'm getting even notes from one of our colleagues, how much he has enjoyed it. So thank you both. We'll be continuing on many of these same points at our Health and Wealth of America discussion in 3 days in early December, as well as on other roundtables. So Josh, take it away.
Yes, thanks, Zachary. Thanks, John. I think, including next Friday, we'll have a conversation post-election called What Just Happened.
Town hall, where everybody's voice is going to be included.
Yeah, so hopefully you'll join us even next Friday, because I think a lot of this will potentially change, and we may have different perspectives, following Tuesday's election, although we may not know even by Friday who the clear winner is. But thank you again for everyone joining us. As I mentioned in the chat, our CDX brand is hosting an event at 2:00, an interesting one focused on how artificial intelligence is helping workers with disabilities. So if you are free, available, please, I put the link in the chat, copy that before we close this one out. So hopefully you'll join us there. Again, this video will be available early next week on our website. You'll all get notes about that so you can share it with your colleagues. As David mentioned, we'll have our 3-day Health and Wealth of America event in early December 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. So hopefully you'll join us for some of that. If you have ideas, topics, speakers, you know how to reach us. And really appreciate everyone taking the time this afternoon, and have a great weekend.
Thanks so much. Getting a lot of great questions, comments in the side chat. So thanks again, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers. Thank you.